Imagine that your beloved 18-year-old daughter, sister, or best friend is terribly afraid of something. She's experiencing panic attacks and having a mental breakdown, and you haven't been able to help her. On a fateful day in July, she suddenly decides to go off with a friend to a nearby beach, and you never see or hear from her again. Is she still alive? Or was she brutally murdered? This is the story of Tammy Lynn Leppert, a young woman whose life seemed perfect from a distance. She was a striking beauty with a blossoming career and a supportive circle of friends and family. Yet her promising path took a dark turn when she vanished without a trace. She left behind an unsolved mystery, and mourning loved ones still searching for her decades later. Join me for a ride through strange and mysterious here at Odd Mysteries Stories. On July 6th, 1983, model, actress, and pageant queen Tami Lynn Leppert asked to be dropped off on a long stretch of highway near Cocoa Beach in Florida. It was only 5 miles from her home. That was the last day anyone ever saw her again. Come along as I explore the story of Tammy's baffling and disturbing disappearance. When she went missing, Tammy was just 18 years old. She was a gorgeous young lady with blonde hair, hazel eyes, and a stunning smile. In fact, she'd always been beautiful. She entered her first beauty contest at the age of 4. Over the course of her life, she competed in over 300 beauty pageants, winning 280 crowns. Tammy was known to be a kind and charming young lady. People said about her that she slept with a smile on her face. Already gracious at the age of 9, she let another girl mistakenly win her pageant crown. Though Tammy had won the pageant fair and square, she said nothing when someone called out the wrong name. She merely smiled and congratulated the new winner. By the time she'd entered her teen years, Tammy was securing work as a model. In October of 1978, she appeared on the cover of the magazine CoverGirl. By 1980, although she'd never trained as an actor, she secured her first acting role. The movie was called Little Darlings, and she had an uncredited part as a party girl. Tammy lived in historic Rockledge, the first incorporated city in Brevard County, Florida. There was a time during the late 18 and early 1900s when Rockledge served as a fashionable resort town. While Tammy was growing up there, Rockledge had become a bedroom community for thousands of aerospace workers and their families connected to the Kennedy Space Center and the Apollo moon landing mission. By any measure, Tammy appeared to be on the fast track to success, but it wasn't all bright lights and sparkling crowns. There was nothing glamorous about Tammy's home life. Tammy's parents divorced when she was 7, and she never had much of a relationship with her father. She had 2 sisters. Debbie Palacios lived across the country in California, and Suzanne Leppert had been adopted by another family before Tammy was born. Neither sister was part of her daily life. And sadly, she didn't know them very well. Tammy endured a complex relationship with her mother, Linda Curtis. Her mother served as her agent and manager. Linda portrayed herself as a devoted mother who enjoyed watching her daughter excel, but there were whispers that Linda was both physically and emotionally abusive. There are even claims that Tammy's mother had pimped her out, and that Linda herself was little more than a bad con artist who had the good fortune of being blessed with a beautiful and profitable daughter. But the details are scarce. Tammy did enjoy at least one positive relationship as she grew up. His name was Wing Flanagan, another one of Linda's clients, who began living at her house when he was just 11 years old. Wing and Tammy were reportedly as close as siblings. Around the time that Tammy disappeared, she also had 2 other close male friends. One was Rick Adams, whom she considered to be her very best friend. The 2 were neither romantically nor physically involved, enjoying a platonic relationship that had endured the test of years. The other was Keith Roberts, a 24-year-old male model. They'd met at the Galaxy Model Workshop, popularly known as Merritt Island. Keith may have been in a romantic relationship with Tammy, and he was, in fact, the last person to ever see her alive. In July 1982, Tammy got what seemed on the surface to be her next lucky break into the film industry. She was cast in another uncredited role as the boxing contest girl in the movie Spring Break. Filming took place in Fort Lauderdale. Tammy did well in her role, good enough to be invited to a weekend party out of town after the film wrapped. It was at this party that Tammy's life seemed to take a bad, irrevocable turn. She went to the party alone, but moved through the crowds like a smiling social butterfly, at least at first. By the end of the party, Tammy emerged as someone else. She'd seen something or heard something she wasn't supposed to. She'd endured some sort of terribly disturbing experience. Based on my research, I know that it absolutely terrified Tammy. She quickly returned to Rockledge, where she became paranoid and evasive. When pressed, she admitted she'd seen something at the party, but she would only say that it was something really bad. Over the following weeks, Tammy dropped a few more hints. She mentioned money laundering, that they would come for her if she spoke about what she'd seen. Regrettably, she wouldn't give any further details. Yet, even the neighbor's new van became a source of fear. Tammy told Wing that the neighbors were spying on her because the van had mirrored windows. So, what do you think could have happened that made Tammy Lynn fear so much for her life? Maybe she was threatened after witnessing a drug transaction. Or maybe she'd somehow become the witness to a kidnapping, or even a murder. Over the next year of her life, we learn a few more clues about what she may have seen. And whatever it was, it took an irreversible toll on Tammy's mental health. While the other members of her household weren't convinced that Tammy was in any physical danger, the events that followed seemed to hint that she had good, rational reasons to be very afraid. Early in 1983, 4 months before she would ultimately disappear, Tammy Lynn scored her biggest opportunity to date. She was cast in the movie Scarface, featuring actor Al Pacino. The movie was being filmed in Miami, so Tammy planned to stay with the family lawyer, Walter Leibowitz. Her role in the movie was that of a girl in a bikini who distracts the lookouts during the famed chainsaw scene. On the 4th day of filming, it all fell apart for Tammy. She was watching another scene in progress. One of the characters was shot in the scene, resulting in a spew of artificial blood. Tammy began to cry hysterically. She could not be calmed or consoled. The crew took her to her trailer, but could do little about her state of fear and anxiety. Eventually, they called Leibowitz to take her home. She quit the film and returned to Rockledge, where Linda made her meet with the local sheriff. When she refused to confide in the sheriff about what she'd seen at the party earlier in the year, or why she became hysterical on the movie set, Linda checked Tammy into Brevard County Medical Health Center. Tammy underwent a complete physical and psychiatric evaluation. They found no physical issues and no evidence of drug or alcohol use. After 72 hours of observation, they released her. Would you agree that the Scarface scene was a reminder of the really bad things she witnessed at the party in 1982? If she saw someone killed, it raises the question of who was murdered and why. If it was a money laundering or drug transaction, she must have been threatened with her life. Upon returning home from the psych ward, Tammy's paranoia increased. She remained indoors as much as possible. Also, it seemed as if she feared being poisoned for some strange reason. She refused to eat from open plates or to drink from containers of tea that Linda would offer her. She would ask Wing to taste her food or would refuse to eat at all. Those around her reported that she developed a wild-eyed look and seemed to be afraid no matter what was happening in the house. Though Wing said that she had both good days and bad days. On July 1st, 1983, Tammy completely snapped, having a type of manic episode. Wing says he was reading on the couch when Tammy started accusing him of simply looking at her. He denied it, but she stormed outside, only to immediately become overwhelmed due to leaving the security of the house. She immediately turned around to go back inside, only to find that the front door had closed behind her and locked. Going mad with fear, she began banging on the front door, demanding to be let in. Her desperation led her to pick up a baseball bat, which she used to break the front window. Wing charged out the front door, begging her to stop. She dropped the bat only to start slapping and hitting at him frantically, screaming that he'd locked her out and demanding to know why. Wing would later say he wasn't sure she even recognized him. Linda rushed outside to calm and comfort her daughter, repeating, "Tammy, it's Mother. I love you," until her panic attack passed. Linda then scheduled a second psychiatric evaluation. As they returned from the doctor's office, Tammy made Linda promise that if anything happened to her, that Linda would get even with that person for her. Linda asked what Tammy thought was going to happen to her. Tammy told her mother, "He is still going to try and kill me," but would not say who it was or why. On July 5, 1983, the day before her disappearance, Tammy left the house with her best friend, Rick Adams. They went to church where she cried uncontrollably. Rick would later report that he believed her mysterious fear to be very real. Rick dropped Tammy off at home, and they made plans to go to church again the next afternoon. Tammy told Rick she loved him, and that she might be going away for a while. Rick didn't press further, believing Tammy meant she was going to go out to California to try to rebuild her career, or maybe become a nurse. The next day, July 6, 1983, Tammy went missing, literally into thin air. Oddly enough, on the morning of July 6, Tammy seemed okay. In fact, she seemed to be happier, acting far more normally than she had in recent months. Linda took it as a sign that Tammy was finally recovering. However, when a person struggling with their mental health suddenly seems happy and relaxed, psychiatrists say it can be a sign they are having suicidal thoughts, meaning the person may feel relieved that the end of their suffering is near and want to hide this decision from those around them. Nevertheless, no one thought it odd when Tammy called Keith and told him that she wanted to go out, even after trying to break the front door down just a few days earlier. Remember that Keith Roberts was one of Tammy's best friends, possibly a romantic partner. Keith made the 2-hour drive from his home in Lakeland to Tammy Lynn's home in Rockledge. He said it was his understanding that Tammy wanted to go to Fort Lauderdale. However, Tammy told Linda she was going to the beach, though she wasn't dressed for it, and she didn't carry a towel, sunscreen, swimsuit, or any other beach accessories. Perhaps it was that singular detail that frightened Linda that day. As Keith's car pulled out of the driveway, she got a bad feeling that something wasn't right with Tammy. But Linda didn't do or say anything about it at the time. Unfortunately, her instincts were right. I would say most of us have had at least one experience like this, where we realize after the fact that we should have listened to our intuition, that sixth sense nudging at us to do something different than we're currently doing. Keith reports that the two of them argued in the car, but I haven't been able to factually confirm what the argument was about. Tammy asked Keith to drop her off in the parking lot of the Glass Bank building in downtown Cocoa Beach. He left her there at approximately 3 p.m. She was about 5 miles from her house. Not an impossible walk home, though it was a long one. While Keith was the last person to see Tammy alive, he was not the last person to hear from her. She began calling her aunt's Cocoa Beach costume shop. She called 3 times, leaving urgent messages and informing her aunt that she was calling from a nearby location. Was she seeking a ride home, or did she want some other type of help? We'll never know. Her aunt was out of town, and another friend Tammy called didn't pick up the phone either. It was only after these frantic phone calls that Tammy disappeared with almost no trace. Nobody saw or heard from her again. Now we are left to wonder, what happened? The first theory is that Tammy met her end at the hands of the mysterious man she'd been afraid of since that party a year earlier. We are again left to wonder exactly what Tammy witnessed that day. Her reaction to The murder scene at the Scarface movie set is telling, but not completely definitive. Of course, if the mystery man from the party did catch up with Tammy, he would have had to have been following her and Keith that day. Otherwise, how would he have known to go after her at a random location off the highway in Cocoa Beach? Keith never reported spotting anybody following them as they drove around, though Tammy was convinced she was being watched. But then, if that was the case, why would Tammy demand to be let out of the car on the side of the road, placing herself in a vulnerable position? Perhaps she really did hope she would quickly connect with her aunt and get to safety, only to be thwarted in the end. In another theory, did Tammy's poor mental health finally catch up to her? Tammy was showing signs of PTSD, and the party following the spring break movie wasn't even the only reason. She had begun to tell friends that her mother's treatment was wearing on her. Plus, she'd had a high-stress career from a very young age. So, the traumatic episode at the party may have been the breaking point. Maybe Tammy took her own life. Suicide could have been consistent with suddenly acting happier that morning after crying uncontrollably the day before. It could also be consistent with her attempt to tell Rick that she was going away for a while. One problem with this theory is that her body was never found. So, what about the theory of dissociative disorder? Essentially, an involuntary escape from reality. It's possible that she merely wandered away in a dissociative state caused by her trauma, disconnecting herself from her past, her behavior, and even her identity. Perhaps she died on the streets, homeless and mentally disturbed, or eventually recovered and found herself in some random town where she took on a new name and rebuilt her life. It might even be possible that Tammy is alive today. But if she is, does she know that her sisters, Suzanne and Debbie, continue to search for her and that hundreds of hours of time and resources have gone into finding her? It can't be easy, hiding herself under such circumstances. And it would seem any danger from the mysterious man at that party would have passed by now, over 40 years later. The FBI theorizes that Tammy's disappearance and likely death had nothing to do with the party or with her mental health. Instead, they claim that she may have run afoul of serial killer Christopher Wilder. Wilder was an amateur photographer who operated in the area until his death 1 year later in 1984. He targeted models and beauty contestants in order to rape and kill them. It so happens that Wilder had met Tammy on the set of the movie Spring Break, so there's a connection there. Additionally, Linda claims that Wilder had once traveled to Brevard County in a fruitless effort to convince her to let him photograph Tammy, so he already had an interest, and that wasn't even his only attempt. A man who strongly resembled Wilder showed up at Linda's modeling agency multiple times in 1983, looking for other models to target. If you recall, Spring Break's after-party was the one where Tammy saw something terrible. Could it have been Wilder raping and perhaps killing a fellow actress? Could Christopher Wilder have been the scary, mysterious man Tammy wouldn't talk about? When Tammy had mentioned money laundering a few weeks after that party, was that something she said just to get people to stop asking questions? Because what would money laundering or some type of drug scheme have to do with it if Tammy met her demise by a serial killer? A few months after Tammy's disappearance, Wilder went on a cross-country crime spree. Criminologists say this could indicate an escalation in his motivation to kill, due to anger toward a group of people or a specific mission he's created for himself. Linda found this serial killer theory so credible that she, Suzanne, and Debbie filed a $1 million claim against Wilder's estate after he died in 1984. They claimed he abducted and probably killed Tammy. Eventually, the case was dropped because there was no physical evidence tying Wilder to Tammy's disappearance. One problem with the Wilder theory is that, for Wilder to have killed Tammy, he would have had to have been stalking her. And there are few signs that he was obsessed with her to that extent. Or he would have happened to follow her that particular day. How else could he know where she was? I suppose it is possible that since Wilder and Tammy were acquaintances, having met on the movie set, maybe Tammy had his phone number, and called him to come give her a ride when she couldn't reach her aunt or anyone else. Or, crazy as it sounds, some people have suggested that maybe Tammy saw Wilder kill someone at that party a year before and finally gave in to her fear. Perhaps she called him knowing he would probably kill her. She didn't seem to be in her right mind. It would be sort of a suicide by serial killer scenario. Unlikely as that sounds. And there's another serial killer theory to consider. A guy named John Brennan Crutchley also lived in Brevard County at the time of Tammy's disappearance. He was a convicted kidnapper and rapist, suspected of murdering up to 30 women. Just like Wilder, Crutchley also went on a crime spree a few months after Tammy's disappearance. But law enforcement couldn't find any physical evidence to tie Crutchley to the crime, and there's no other known link between Tammy and Crutchley. In 1983, there were 310,000 other people who lived in Brevard County. The chances that he would have met Tammy in some random encounter seems relatively slim. If Crutchley did kill Tammy, it probably would have been a crime of opportunity, a scenario wherein he comes across a confused young woman wandering around Cocoa Beach, alone, defenseless, and beautiful. Wrong place, wrong time. Yet another theory is that Tammy planned her own disappearance. After all, she told Rick she was going away for a while. She had spoken about distancing herself from Linda and had even called her sister Debbie at one point to ask if she could live with her in California. Tammy and Linda argued over her career all the time, and Tammy spoke about leaving both her mother and the town of Rockledge behind. Perhaps Tammy just had enough and asked Keith to let her out on Cocoa Beach so she could walk away and start a new life without telling anyone where she'd gone. Linda refuses to believe Tammy left voluntarily. She admits she and Tammy got into arguments, but said the arguments weren't serious. She knew about the plan to go to California and said that Tammy was excited to take her career to the next level. But Linda saw no reason why Tammy would run away. I suppose Tammy could have taken a taxi or hitchhiked to an airport or the Greyhound bus station. From there, she could travel to California or anywhere else in the country. But in her state of mind, having some sort of mental breakdown, would she have the strength and clarity to strike out on her own? It's nice to think of Tammy having a happy ending, alive and well, living a new life all these years. But do you think that's really possible? Yet another theory is that her best friend or romantic partner, Keith, was the man who killed her. Homicide detectives often start investigating the people nearest and dearest when someone gets murdered. Keith was both one of Tammy's closest confidants and the last person to see her alive. What are we to make of the discrepancy in a story that shows him and Tammy going to the beach without beach gear? Of course, anyone can go to the beach just to take a walk or watch the waves. It can be a soothing activity when a person is feeling distressed. But here's another shocking detail. Tammy's sister, Suzanne, believed that Tammy was 3 months pregnant on the day of her disappearance. Was Keith the father? And did Tammy break the news to him that day? Was that what they argued about? Linda even claims that Tammy actually told her that she was afraid of Keith. But why? Would unexpected fatherhood really be motive enough to turn Keith against Tammy? The police investigated Keith as a suspect, but never found any evidence to link him to her disappearance. He dropped her off at the Glass Bank building and left. There's one last possibility to explore. Police said they received 2 tip calls from an unidentified woman after Tammy's disappearance. The woman claimed that Tammy was alive and well, that she was going to school to become a nurse. This would support the theory that Tammy planned her own disappearance. Perhaps Tammy herself made those calls, her attempt to reassure the public, the police, and her family and friends that she was okay, that they did not need to look for her. There is just one problem. Linda says that the story is impossible because Tammy was deathly afraid of blood and would never actually become a nurse. Could Tammy somehow have overcome her phobia? Others she knew had said it was Tammy's dream to become a nurse. Or was it one of the hundreds of crank calls police routinely receive during an investigation? The police certainly didn't take the calls as serious evidence that Tammy was alive. In fact, they studied the remains of 13 different women between 1984 and 2014, comparing them to physical samples from Tammy Lynn. None of those comparisons produced an exact match. As of 2020, police have a far better DNA profile of Tammy, but they still don't have dental records or fingerprints. Sadly, in October 1995, Linda passed away at the age of 54 without ever finding out what happened to her daughter. Tammy's sisters are still searching for her. Suzanne Leppert says she will never stop looking for the sister she never got a chance to know. I've linked to her Facebook page in the story notes. On another note, do you think Tammy's case ties into another unsolved mystery, one that has never been formally linked to her story? She saw something at that party. If it was a murder, you'd think the police would be able to follow the threads in that case to Tammy's disappearance. Tammy Lynn Leppert was last seen wearing a blue shirt decorated with flowers, a denim skirt, a gray purse, and sandals. If you have any information about where she might be, please consider coming forward with the information. You can call the Cocoa Beach Police Department at 321-868-3254. And if you or someone you know may be struggling with thoughts of suicide, I encourage you to call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988, a short, easy phone number to the hotline. As always, I welcome your comments about this unsolved missing persons case. It was hard to filter through some of the information during my research and decipher fact from fiction. I want to be as accurate as possible, even though this is a summary of Tammy's story, not an investigation. So please let me and my viewers know in the comments if you have any further factual details to share, as well as your thoughts and opinions about the case. You may also be interested in a story about Angel Tony Torres. He was a young college student who mysteriously vanished. Was it a drug deal gone bad? Mistaken identity? Or maybe he knew something he shouldn't? Click on Tony's video to hear his story.